It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you one of our speakers tonight, Joseph Backholm. Joseph, to put it simply, has my job in Washington State. And he does out there, there's 38 different, what we call family policy councils around the country, and we all work together. And watching what Joseph went through in this last election when they had the marriage amendment on the ballot was truly heroic, what Joseph had to do. And he's going to come to tonight and share with you what happened in Washington State. And I want you to listen carefully because they've already legalized same-sex marriage, and the fallout from that is what Ohio is going to be looking at if we allow that to happen here. Joseph Backholm has served as the Executive Director of the Family Policy Institute in Washington, the FPIW, and FPIW Action since December 2008. FPIW coordinates with 38 other state family policy councils who advocate for families. FPIW, boy, I'll get it right by the time I get to the end. CCV is much simpler, you know. Advocates on behalf of marriage, life, religious freedom, and parental rights. He also served as chairman of the Preserve Marriage Washington, a campaign to define marriage as the relationship between a man and a woman in the state of Washington. After law school, he worked as a real estate attorney before taking position on staff council in the Washington State Senate, overseeing the committees on transportation and economic development. He is a frequent guest on state and national media outlets speaking on the issues related to marriage, life, religious freedom, and parental rights. Born and raised in Aberdeen, Washington, Joseph attended the University of Washington, where he majored in psychology, and the Seattle University of School of Law. He and his wife, Brooke, live with their 4 children in Briar, Washington. Please welcome Joseph Backholm.
That looks like it. Good evening. It's great to be with you. This is my first time in the state of Ohio. I've been here for several hours now, and I love it. As Phil said, I'm here to warn you about the future, because Washington is what we are. But I'm also here to tell you that you can watch decades of football futility and come through at the end with victory. There is hope. So for all of you Bengals fans, I have been there. And it gets better. But it's a pleasure for me to be with you guys and to work with Phil and the friends that we have around the country, because this really is a partnership. And we kind of have our, and I appreciate the message, Pat. We have our one note that we get to play, and we get to do it in the same place. But together, it makes a symphony, and at least it should. And if we're all doing our job, and that's kind of what we're here to talk about tonight. And I'm going to, a little bit about myself, and I think, here we go. Okay. That's my crew, and we're the Family Policy Institute, and this is what we're about. We want to create cultures that are good for families. And those are my 4 kids, and they're home, and my wife's with them, and they can't. I had a 10-hour layover in Denver to get here. I got here at 5 o'clock in the morning. They couldn't have done that. That wouldn't have been fun. But really, most importantly, as Phil hinted at, and as I said, I'm here to tell you, you guys are maybe looking at, and likely in the future, a battle over what the definition of marriage is in Ohio. And we have been there, and we have made a bad decision, and I can warn you about the future. It's actually not quite that bad. That was for dramatic effect. But I am here to tell you a little bit of warning from what it could be, because whatever troubles you have here in Ohio with your public policy, I assure you that ours are worse. But the effect of this, as you consider what's going to happen with the definition of marriage, and we know that this debate is going on all over the country, and really what I want to focus on for a few minutes here is this subject of religious liberty. And what does this mean, and what has happened? Because, Washington State became one of the 3 first jurisdictions in the history of human civilization, where a group of people got together and voted to redefine marriage. Had never happened before, historical in a very bad way. But what does that mean? And that's what we're going to talk about, because I hope to be able to motivate and ultimately encourage you guys in what you're doing here with CCV, and I thank you so much for working with them, and in Washington, you guys are really what makes it work. But what is the problem? What have we been dealing with? And there are a number of examples before I get to that slide. 2012, November of 2012, marriage was redefined. We never had litigation involving the subject of homosexuality, non-discrimination laws, same-sex marriage in the history of the state. Immediately thereafter, here's what started happening. A court clerk in kind of rural eastern Washington nearly lost her job because she said, well, I'm not comfortable signing this. And so, big brouhaha. Ultimately, she was kind of reassigned rather than fired. But the fact that she nearly lost her job because she wasn't comfortable signing something was the first sign of trouble. What else happened? There was a judge, a Superior Court judge in Thurston County, which is the county where our state capital is, and he is a believer, and he said he started looking around the courthouse just privately for judges who would be willing to do these same-sex weddings if he was asked, because he wasn't willing to do that. And so the fact that he didn't want to became public knowledge. And another brouhaha ensued, as it's kind of the theme in all of this. If you have a different opinion, there's a brouhaha. And as a result, he was reprimanded by the Bar Association in the state of Washington and told that he would never be allowed to perform another wedding of any kind if he was not willing to perform same-sex weddings. For those of you who are business owners, you will appreciate the next couple of examples. A company called O'Reilly's Auto Parts. I think that they're actually national, but they had a big deal out of the state of Washington, where the Attorney General filed a complaint against them. They were a self-insured company, but they didn't provide benefits for same-sex. They didn't acknowledge same-sex marriage within their company policy. And the Attorney General, who's of course the chief law enforcement officer in our state, initiated legal action against them, and they eventually had to cave. A class action lawsuit was started in the state of Washington against Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, another national company with a presence in Washington state, and because of what our law said about same-sex marriage and what it said about non-discriminating, a class action lawsuit was formed against a company just simply trying to do business because of the leadership of that company's beliefs about this subject. And then those are kind of the big companies. And then there's a little company. And this is a story involving a florist. Her name is Baronelle Stutzman. And I'm going to tell you a little bit. She's the lady there on the right. Baronelle Stutzman owns a florist shop called Arlene's Flowers in rural eastern Washington. And the gentlemen on the left were a gay couple who she considered friends, had been selling flowers to for 9 years, a very good relationship. This is a woman who has employed gay people. There are lots of people who have, I have the ability to be mean to people. And I assume some of you in this room do. Baronelle Stutzman does not. There are a lot of people who, you might genuinely say maybe you did mistreat somebody, in a moment if there was an altercation. Baronelle Stutzman doesn't even have it in her. She's got like 18 grandchildren. She's just the most pleasant person you would ever encounter. And after marriage was redefined, these gentlemen came in and said, hey, you're our florist. We're going to have a gay wedding. And she said, we want you to do this with us. We'd like you to provide the floral services. And it wasn't a crazy question because they had that kind of a relationship. From both accounts, they had a conversation that was really respectful. They hugged. The client said, we understand your position, but ultimately she said, that's not something I can do, because it's not about just selling flowers over the counter. She would have had to go, and for those of you who have ever been part of a wedding, the florist doesn't just sell flowers over the wedding. They're part of the event, and that wasn't something that she felt she could do. And so they parted ways. Well, a conversation ensued on Facebook, as where all bad conversations take place, in social media, and as a result, the gentleman on our left is our Attorney General. His name is Bob Ferguson, and he became aware of the fact that this florist in eastern Washington, this grandmother who was running a small business, had decided that this was an event she did not want to be part of, and he did something which was historic in Washington state, and he initiated legal action against a small business because of the decision that she made about marriage. Now, there have been a number of altercations, legal altercations, because of this subject, but this was historic because for the first time, it wasn't initiated by the clients. It was initiated by the state. And the state said, oh, you did that? You can't do that in this state. Therefore, we will use all of the state's police powers to come against you, small business, and force you to do the thing that we want you to do. And again, hired gay people, never been accused by anyone, including the clients in question, of mistreating anybody. This was just her conviction about this issue. Subsequently, the couple has actually been convinced by the ACLU to file their own lawsuit, and so she's now the subject of 2 separate lawsuits arising from the same incident where she simply said, this isn't business that I'm comfortable providing. Quick question, and this is important for you in Washington as you consider this. During the debate over the redefinition of marriage, we had kind of this back and forth. As I was on the side, I was helping run the campaign that said marriage should be a relationship between a man and a woman. And one of the arguments that we were always making was, well, this doesn't just affect people who want to share their lives together and have loving, committed relationships. This is going to reduce religious freedom for people who disagree. And the other side said, oh, nonsense. This won't affect anyone's religious freedom. All it's going to do is provide opportunity for the loving, committed couples who want to live together. That's kind of the rhetoric. And so, of course, this happens within months after this. And so we're like, hey, looks like people lost their religious freedom. And they're like, oh, nonsense. They still won't concede the point. And the reason is, this has nothing to do with the redefinition of marriage. This has to do with the non-discrimination statute. And in 2005, Washington State passed a non-discrimination statute that listed sexual orientation as a protected class in Washington state law. Now, I know Ohio does not have that, but I know that many municipalities within the state of Ohio have that. And how these work together, and these are very important to note, because from 2005 to 2012, there had never been an incident over this subject. But it wasn't until marriage was redefined that the conflict started to arise, because that's the moment at which the law now disagreed with the conscience of millions of people in the state. So it's kind of like scissors, that the marriage law isn't so bad for religious freedom without the non-discrimination policy, and the non-discrimination policy isn't so bad without having redefined marriage. But when you have the 2 things together, you not only is the law at odds with people's conscience, but you have a number of incidences arising where people are forced to make that decision and become public about the fact that this is how I feel. And so both of those things are important. So it isn't just the redefinition of marriage, it's the desire to create a protected legal status for sexual orientation that, combined with marriage, really causes problems. Now this, if you ever have a conversation about this subject, and you're going to, again, whether you like it or not, and we all wish we weren't, but you're going to have a conversation about this, here's the first question that always arises. Isn't this basically like segregation? If this sweet little grandmother is allowed not to do business for people she doesn't want to, aren't you basically just reinstituting racially based segregation? And of course, the answer to that is no. But why? And this is an important question, I think, for us to be able to answer. And here's the difference. And I'm going to get a little legal here, so I apologize for that in advance. What is the difference? Non-discrimination statutes say you can't discriminate on the basis of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, veteran status, national origin, all of those things. And basically that means you can't have a policy as a company that says, I don't do business with Korean people. I don't do business with women. I don't do business with Mexican people. You can't have a policy that says, because of your membership in this class, I won't work with you. That's what a non-discrimination law says. But what happened with Baronel Stutzman, she had no such policy that I won't work with gay people. She hired gay people. She'd worked with these gay people knowing they were gay for nearly a decade. That was not the issue. The problem was this was a particular event she didn't want to be part of. And the truth is, 2 heterosexual people could have walked into the florist office and said, hey, my brother's having a gay wedding. Will you provide the flowers? And she would have said no. And 2 gay people could come in and say, hey, we're having a graduation party or a company picnic. Will you provide some flowers? And she would have said yes. It had nothing to do with the people requesting the service, but the service being requested. It's an important distinction, and that's the reason why it has nothing to do with segregation, because I'm not refusing to work with you. It's just that you happen to be asking me to do something that isn't consistent with my conscience. And so, refusing to work with a protected class under the law, that is not allowed. Refusing to provide certain services, at least in old school America, was allowed. And we're not having the debate about whether that's still going to be allowed. But I think that's an important distinction to understand. It's not the person asking for the service, but it's the service being requested. Now, if they service a straight wedding, isn't their refusal to service a gay wedding discrimination? I have a logo up there that you might recognize in the back of the NRA. And the reason I did that is because there's an analogy that I think is helpful. Because this entire fact set becomes obvious to most people as long as you're not talking about gay marriage, because that's kind of the hyper-emotional subject that nobody can really think rationally about. Imagine a situation where you're a website designer and you have a website designing business, and someone comes to you, and you are a pacifist. And so the local chapter of the NRA approaches you and says, hey, we have this great new concept for this cool website. We want you to build it for us. And you say, no, I'm a pacifist. Go away. I hate you and everything you do. Should you as an American have the right to do that? Everybody's going to answer that question and say, well, yeah. Should the socialist guy have to design something for the Republican Party? All sorts of examples. Should the Jewish guy have to do something for the Nazi Party? The answer to that is no. Only in the context of a discussion about same-sex marriage would anybody really even, question that. It's obvious. So analogies are helpful. Who else is losing their religious freedom? And I'm not going to talk about all of these. You'll probably, unfortunately for his sake, recognize the picture up there on the left now, Brendan Eich, who's the gentleman who was just fired from his job at Mozilla because in 2008, well, he was basically fired. He was pressured out because in 2008 he made a contribution that they didn't like to a campaign to protect the definition of marriage. One other that I'll highlight there, the Wildflower Inn, is an inn in Vermont owned by a couple who didn't want to have their private property used for a same-sex wedding. They ended up being sued and had to pay a $30,000 fine and agree never to have their property used for a wedding just because they didn't want it used for a particular purpose. A $30,000 fine on your conscience. Lots of examples. We could talk about it all night. But one thing I want to highlight for you here is we've navigated this in Washington State, and I think becomes obvious. I hope will become more clear. Why? Why do they care? Why do they want this person to sell them their flowers? Why do they want this person to provide them, to sign their wedding certificate? Why do they want this person to take their pictures? Why can't they go find somebody else? And I think this is an important question to keep in mind as you have this debate. Why is it so important? And in order to answer that question, I'm going to tell a quick story about the last 20 years, and it ends kind of what's in Washington State. Protecting religious freedom then and now. And quickly, I want to go back to 1993. In 1993, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. The acronym is RFRA because in 1990, the Supreme Court made a decision that lowered the protections for religious freedom generally across the country. And Congress looked at that decision and said, we don't like that. We want the standard raised. So 3 years together, they came back and passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. They restored the standard that existed prior to that decision in 1993. Now, shockingly, or maybe not surprisingly, it passed with broad bipartisan support. It got through the House 425-0. It passed the Senate 97-3. Bill Clinton, who's no hard right-winger, signed this thing. Came into law. A friend of mine who is an attorney for World Vision in my neck of the woods in Washington was part of the lobby committee for RFRA in Washington, D.C. when this was passed. The co-chair of the committee he was on was the chief lobbyist for the ACLU. That tells you the kind of coalition that came together around this idea of religious freedom. Some of the people who signed this, you'll recognize some of these folks. Joe Biden, Patty Murray, Dianne Feinstein, John Kerry, Joe Lieberman, Harry Reid. And if you know anything about public policy, you'll know that this is not like a vast right-wing conspiracy. All of these folks voted for RFRA in 1993. Folks in the House. Some of these are Washington State specific. Maria Cantwell, the guy on the left is Jay Inslee, the top left. He's our governor now. And Barney Frank and some of these other guys. Joe Kennedy, Steny Hoyer. Again, not a vast right-wing conspiracy. All of them could come around this idea that we support religious freedom. Now, fast forward to 2013. This is last fall in Washington State. And this will be connected. Some of you will remember the story that just happened in the state of Arizona when they tried to just do a little amendment to a Religious Freedom Restoration Act that they already have in place. And kind of, all hell broke loose over this idea that religious freedom equals discrimination. Now, last fall in Washington State, we had introduced a bill just in a study committee that was almost identical to the RFRA that was passed in Congress in 1993, that has subsequently been passed by 18 states. And it received a very cool reception by the committee that held it. Why? Because they wanted to know, if this is passed, will it allow people to not sell flowers or not do the floral services at a wedding? And the other question they asked, because this was Washington State specific, or would it allow a pharmacist, for example, not to sell an abortion drug if they don't want to? Because we've had litigation in Washington State for 7 years where the government's trying to force a pharmacy that's owned by a pro-life couple to not sell Plan B, which is a drug that induces abortion. They don't want to sell it. There's lots of drugs they don't sell, but the government wants to say, if you're going to be a pharmacist, you have to sell this drug specifically. They've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own money defending themselves against the state, trying to force them to sell that. But it's interesting to see that in 1993, everybody came together around this idea that we love religious freedom. Only 20 years later, suddenly everybody's very cautious and very skeptical about this idea of religious freedom because of the freedoms it might allow. Why is this? And this is a theory, but I think there's lots of circumstantial evidence to back this up. What happened in those 20 years? And I believe that the value system of our friends on the left has changed because they used to care about individual rights. It was the hallmark of liberalism, individual liberty even to an excess. We want to be able to burn flags, be profane, make drugs, make pornography, distribute it, do whatever we want. The government should not be able to tell me what to do, right? That was liberalism, and we stodgy conservatives were the ones saying, well, you shouldn't be able to do anything, right? That's why we're conservative, because we don't like change. They cared so much about individual rights that it defined them. They're liberals. Well, what happened? They have exchanged the value system. The primary value of the left is no longer individual rights. Now their focus is tolerance and ending discrimination. It's been a shift in what the ultimate goal is. Now they want to create a world in which no one can discriminate or no one is intolerant. And of course, those are totally subjective concepts. But it's important because if your ultimate goal is to stop discrimination, that means people can't have the freedom to do things that you believe are discriminatory. So now, where individual freedom used to be the goal, now it's the problem. Which is why religious freedom and the things that we always understand and hold so dear that used to define our country is now a problem to be solved rather than the solution to the problem. And I think that's really important as we think about all this. But I want to leave you on a more positive note because we hear all these stories of, everybody being litigated. There's kind of this hysteria, and it's not totally unfounded because there is a war on religious freedom. There's a war on our values. It's happening in Washington State. It's happening in Ohio. It's happening all over the country. But I want us to remember, because when we hear all these stories, sometimes in our little echo chambers, we kind of, feel like victims. But we have to remember who we are in all of this, that we are not victims. And that's why I put this up there, that our faith in the one who placed us here for such a time as this, as we're talking about tonight, that Jesus wins, truth wins at all times, and we need to act like we believe that's real. We need to act like we believe that's real, which means, the fear, we don't need to be afraid of them because we've already won this thing. Yeah, it's a skirmish. Yeah, they're wrong. Yeah, it's going to cause problems if they win. But we win in the long run. And something that I encourage you to read if you're ever discouraged, and memorize it and read it a bunch of times. Romans chapter 8. For your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. As big as our problems are, the first century church had it a lot worse. And there are a lot of our brothers and sisters all over the world that would chuckle at the fact that we consider what we're dealing with real problems. So some perspective is helpful. But Paul knew what real problems were. And he said, so we are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. But no, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height and depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. Nothing. Be confident. Be confident. And why does that matter? Is because if we are not motivated by love, we are a sounding brass and a clanging cymbal. And they need to know that. And fear does not conquer fear. They're afraid. Fear does not conquer fear. Love casts out fear. And they need to see that, they need to smell it, they need to feel it in everything that we do. I don't know if you've seen the movie Captain Phillips, but if you haven't, you should. I'll tell a little analogy at the end. long story short, he gets captured in a lifeboat and taken hostage by some pirates. And he's in this boat about the size of this stage with these pirates who have weapons, and they think they're pretty scary, and and they beat him up pretty good, and he's not having a really good time. But there's a moment in that movie where they open up he's in this little deal, and they open up the back of it, and behind him is a battleship and a cruiser. And suddenly the pirates don't feel so tough anymore. They were the guys, running the ship with the guns, but there's a day coming. We might feel like we're kidnapped at the moment, and we might feel like, and they might think they have the leverage, but there's a day coming when the door's going to open, and God's going to show up, and he's going to be on our side. And you better have acted the whole way that you knew he was coming, because he's coming. And if you were afraid the whole time, and then they look at you and like, he's with you, and what were you afraid of? Noah wasn't on the wrong side of history. He was on the wrong side of public opinion. For a brief moment, but then God showed up. And he will show up. Be with God. You will be vindicated, because he's always vindicated. Thank you for your time.